Okay, welcome to this video where I thought I would give a general introduction to the philosophy of science. I probably should have started out with this video in the beginning, but in any case, I think it might help in terms of the more specialized topics I continue to make videos on. Then you can relate hopefully to some themes which I cover in this video, where I really want to give a schematic approach using diagrams essentially to look at some of the most common themes seen throughout the philosophy of science. If we briefly discuss the field itself, one could choose to look at philosophy of science through a lens of epistemology, for instance, that is the study of knowledge, where you could look at philosophy of science as a subset of epistemology, where we're going from some core evidence claims into making conclusions, hopefully, in terms of the evidence. But the evidence here is empirical evidence gathered from science or other scientific methods that are used within the sciences. And one could likewise ask knowledge questions concerning science. One could ask what really is scientific knowledge? How does scientific knowledge differ from other fields of study? Can we truly know an independent world through scientific knowledge, which leads us to the realism, anti-realism debate and so forth? So there's a lot of knowledge questions one can take from a generalized vantage point of epistemology and then bring them over to philosophy of science. So that is one approach. And as we get more into the fundamental level, if you will, what lies at the foundations of the ontology and what really exists, then we intersect more with metaphysics. But in general, philosophy of science is very much intersected with epistemology. So that is something that you will see throughout the study of philosophy of science. Another thing to consider might be to ask what is the usefulness of philosophy of science in general. There's the famous quote by Feynman saying that the philosophy of science might be useful for the birds, which is amusing, and I'm not sure it's even a real quote, but I would love if it was a real quote, because it's amusing and in many ways self-contradictory, because Feynman himself took the most philosophical approach to physics in many ways, and for evidence of this, just asked some of his collaborators, such as Leonard Susskind, for instance, and he'll corroborate that Feynman was in many ways very philosophical in his approach to physics. But we should look at the usefulness, not so much in terms of past Nobel Prize winners crediting philosophy of science or the ideas taken from them in terms of aiding them in their own work. Okay, that is one form of evidence, but rather, there are other scenarios. There was a philosopher, I don't remember his name, but he did found a philosophy journal on the basis of his reading of Lakatos and his research programs. And one of the criteria he instilled in this journal was that everyone who contributed to the journal, they must in advance send their hypotheses which they wanted to design their study on. So that meant that you couldn't do the study first and then post hoc make the hypothesis fit the results in the study, but you had to submit your hypothesis in advance. And also you had to submit all your data, which is very common now, but maybe 10-15 years ago it was less common for you to publish all of your data as well. So that is one very important instance where you get a strong inspiration coming from the philosophy of science, where it actually aids in the scientific work itself. So it has practical ramifications. So that is something that is important to instill if you're learning the philosophy of science. It actually has some usefulness. In any case, what we will see in this more scripted portion of the video is going through some themes and common subjects that are often covered in philosophy of science, and I got them from this book by, it's edited by Ian Hacking, and he goes through some commonalities in the philosophy of science. In his introduction, he lists several points, and I took inspiration from them, you could say. But in general, it also has a lot of interesting articles by leading figures from philosophy of science, like Kuhn and Putnam and Lakatos and Hacking himself. So definitely worth a read, and it has, I got this used copy, and it has that good old used book smell, that aroma of a used book. So that is also an advantage. But on a more serious note, let's get into the video itself. Okay, we will begin here, as mentioned in the introduction, our diagrammatic approach to the philosophy of science by working our way through the following diagrams, where the first diagram contains some common touched upon themes in the subject, as well as the second, where the goal here really is to explore what people tend to care about in the field, or alternatively what has been deemed important historically. There is of course the caveat that the field has also undergone specialization into particular sciences such as philosophy of physics, medicine, biology, chemistry, etc. But we will in this video fully concern ourselves with the original branch, so to speak, which evolved really late in terms of the history of philosophy in the 20th century. That is not to say that earlier philosophers such as Aristotle did not contemplate upon the sciences, but rather that the warrant as a separate working discipline really became increasingly apparent in the 20th century with programs such as the logical positivist program, along with Popperian and later with a Kuhnian approach program, following the latter's highly successful book. So with that out of the way, let's get into some core, highly discussed concepts in the philosophy of science. Our first entry concerns the realism-anti-realism debate, where usually one defends either the position that science concretely tries to discover things about the real world, and this is an endeavor that we can make progress on under realism, or the opposing claim that says that science, and more so scientific theories, do not need to describe a mind-independent reality. And it follows that scientific progress is not in terms of mind-independent realism, but rather in terms of a large umbrella of problem solving. Views on the realism side includes strong scientific realism, which says that we are finding out about the real independent world through science, structural realism, which says that there are true structures of the world, and entity realism, which says that we have good grounds for believing in unobservable entities such as electrons. We might also add here a nuanced version of scientific relativism, which posits that there exists an objective mind-independent reality, but that we can only achieve scientific progress relative to our given cultural conceptual framework that we have adopted. Thus, there exists no objective progress in science. On the other anti-realism camp, we find constructive empiricists, who I have made a video on earlier, which endorse empirical adequacy in terms of what we can know, instrumentalism, which does not care about realism but rather cares about making accurate predictions, where scientific theories are simply useful instruments or calculation tools which we employ. Lastly, we might also add social constructivists, who endorse the view that mind-independent reality does not exist independently outside of human inventions, such as language, culture, and societal norms. These, I think, make for a good sample of views, although there are of course more views in the field. We next move on to the problem of scientific demarcation in the table, which asks us if we can make a sharp distinction between scientific and non-scientific theories. We briefly touched upon this problem when we talked about falsifiability in relation to Popper in the video I made on the Duhem-Quine thesis, where Popper famously endorsed a program of falsification of individual theories in order to demarcate bad science from that of good science. Other approaches would include stressing empirical verifiability as historically endorsed by the logical positivists, of which I really should make a separate video on, or student of Popper Lakatos, who said we should, rather than aim at distinguishing individual theories, we should focus on research programs. Here, a research program is scientific if it continues to predict novel testable predictions, expand knowledge, etc. Other alternatives include adopting a more myopic view and claim that science is really what we associate with science classes from high school, such as lab experiments, careful measurements, etc., which leads us to accept natural sciences as having a particular esteemed position in regards to science and displace the social sciences in that manner. We might alternatively give fundamental physics an especially esteemed placement, as is done by the ontic structuralists, since they claim it places the strongest general ontological constraints. Thus, in this interpretation, the role of the other disciplines for them to claim scientific status, then they would need to construct theories that participate in successful empirical science, as well as ensure that their ontological interpretations do not contradict the constraints imposed by our best working fundamental physics. Lastly, as an alternative, we can ignore that this is a problem at all and grant disciplines like astrology, etc., the role of science, but claim that in terms of a science, these fields completely fail to make any progress in terms of generating features that we want, including novel testable predictions, overall testability, progress over time, or postulating cases of falsifiability that would render their theories false. I put the physicist Sean Carroll in this camp, for example, who also has strong interests in philosophy, by the way, where let's watch a clip of him making this point himself, where he seems rather jaded with the question.
Honestly, I'm not that interested in demarcating science from pseudoscience. I think that a lot of times there's bad science, which some people who don't like it want to discredit by labeling it as pseudoscience. I'm perfectly happy to say that intelligent design is science. It's just crappy science. I don't have to pay any attention to it. It's obviously wrong. So I don't need to bend over backwards to invent philosophical ways of arguing that it's illegitimate. I just think it's bad.
Next, we move on to discussing scientific language, where it's immediately apparent that science utilizes precise technical language with mixed meanings. But we might ask, how objective is the language and how is language used in science? For the latter, there is a strong case to be made that language in science should be tentative, objective, and avoid grand claims which are not substantially demonstrated. But in scientific practice, it is not hard to find examples of the abuse of language. For instance, one may obfuscate clear meaning by relying on scientific jargon or impose difficult scientific diagrams when it is not warranted. One may even introduce overtly scientific terms in order to appear quote-unquote more scientific, where offenders of this practice are often to be found in the social sciences. Some relevant philosophical questions for this observation, then, is to ask in what way this harms our understanding, communication, and general overall trust in science. We should also add here that with the advancement and use of generative AI, this again opens the door for it to become easier to get away with the generation of low-level articles, overtly verbose language, etc. But on the positive side, it may also aid researchers who do not speak English as their first language, so all is not bad with this new advancement. For the objectivity of language in science, or addressing how objective language really is, we may point to theories which hold that language is to be treated as a specialized system of representation that shapes our understanding of reality. Here, a very interesting question to explore, for instance, would be to ask in which sense shifting scientific vocabularies changes the objective world where we perceive or construct depending on your given philosophically held beliefs. Philosophers also analyze how scientific terms gain meaning and how theories are structured by logic, where throughout the history of philosophy, logic has played a key role, as it has also played in analytic philosophy overall. In the case for science, logic has been extensively used, especially by the logical empiricist tradition, in terms of translating scientific theories, as well as illuminate them and explore their potential strengths and weaknesses. There are, of course, philosophers in this tradition who have less emphasized logic and have less mathematical tools at their disposal as well, but it is certainly an advantage to develop these tools, in my opinion. Lastly, we should emphasize that language has also played a key part in the constructivist tradition of the philosophy of science, in terms of emphasizing the view that language is not a neutral tool for reflecting our independent reality, but rather gives us conceptual understanding and social communities in terms of researchers who are actively carving out and creating new language. The more radical route to go here would be to also explore a more language game Wittgensteinian approach, in which scientific talk functions as rule-bound activities embedded in specific ways of working and dictates how we navigate scientific conversations. This again, they claim, greatly impacts our development of new scientific theories. Let's next take a look at the old historical chestnut of exploring the concept of the unity of science, i.e. the notion that we can collect together different branches of science under one shared umbrella. We should observe that certainly when we speak about the non-philosophical public, it is very much the case that we have a population that has embedded ideas about the philosophy of science, which goes something like this. There is a clear hierarchy of sciences, where, to take an example, sociology reduces to psychology, which again reduces to biology, then chemistry until we reach physics. This view is known as reductionism, and I would say that if anything, if history is a trend for future predictions, then what we have witnessed so far is the exact opposite of reductionism. Namely, the fact that the varying branches have become more and more specialized and uniquely characterized according to their own scientific descriptions. Even if we should grant that we can fully reduce, say, psychology to fundamental physics, it's not necessarily the case that this should be super useful to us, as the more foundational laws of physics themselves may not be useful in psychology. Fundamental physics, after all, describes particles and their interactions, where there may exist such a strong embedded level of stochasticity, which makes them in turn far too complex to apply to the realm of mental health. It thus remains an open question how much help is derived from utilizing the extremely small scales of particles and applying them to large systems within mental health, for instance. Other historical attempts at the unity of science include the logical positivists, who imagined a shared unified language of science constructed using the tools of formal logic, which relied upon physical empirical premises. The goal here was to apply a translation process to fields such as biology and reducing them to basic physical terms, including laws written in formal logic. We could mention here the central figure of the philosopher Rudolf Carnap, who shared this goal, where there were also technical attempts, such as Carl Hempel's covering laws, but we will not get into more details about that here, as it serves best for a separate video. One alternative, if we concede that the sciences are too hard to reduce altogether, then we could alternatively instead focus upon a unity in terms of methodology, where we can highlight the commonalities of sciences, not by their explicit shared empirical content, but rather by their shared empirical methods, as well as logical scientific reasoning. Lastly, we should briefly mention the opposing side of scientific pluralism, who claims that complex systems create new emergent properties altogether at higher levels that cannot be fully explained or reduced by fundamental physics alone. We next move on to discussing paradigms and revolutions in science, which was really at the forefront of the project of the famed philosopher Thomas Kuhn, following his landmark book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn argued that science progresses through two distinct phases, a first phase characterized by normal science, where researchers agreed on certain paradigms, which he took to be a set of shared theories, standards, and overall shared scientific values, to a revolutionary phase where a new framework replaces the old one, which is also preceded first by a stage of anomalies, progressing to crises, where the revolution kicks in afterwards. This can also be visualized easily, if you will, by the following Kuhnian cycle, where you might want to pause the video and read the description of the various cycles if you wish. In any case, this of course is a framework which has also met its shared deal of critics. For one, it's difficult to characterize what exactly constitutes a shared paradigm, as the two categories mentioned before are huge categories where it's natural to think that a researcher may share a certain value set which emphasizes scientific virtues, yet there may exist a whole competition of theories which the researchers disagree upon. This is the case, for instance, with the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, where there is no one overwhelming majority. Furthermore, Kuhn likes in general to use his preferred example of a scientific revolution by taking the case of Einstein's general relativity replacing Newtonian gravity. But one may equally argue that scientific change is far less radical. It may, for instance, instead be the case very often that a new set of theories attract many researchers, which lead to many new publications, where an existing framework has less people working in that area. Over time, then, the new research program replaces the old one, but this process is much more gradual and nuanced, leading critics to view Kuhn's idea of revolutions as far too rigid. Consider, for example, chaos theory or non-linear dynamics, which in the 80s saw an explosion of new articles, following important work done in the 70s, where the scientific emphasis also gained popular attraction in the 90s. However, chaos theory certainly did not replace an incommensurable set of laws, where it in fact utilized deterministic differential equations, among others, in order to point out new surprising phenomena. That is, it used the existing framework. To conclude then, Kuhn's idea of paradigms and revolutions have gathered a lot of attention from the philosophy of science, along with his emphasis placement on historical context and sociology intersecting with science, but there have also been many disagreements and more nuanced intermediate positions popping up. Next in the table is the problem of induction, which is really a problem in epistemology brought in historically by the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who stated that we cannot logically prove that future events following directly from past stable patterns. One can immediately see the problem here, as it seems that all of science relies upon induction, as what a researcher in many ways is doing is testing novel ideas in reference to the success of past theories, experiments, and observations. There is also the immediate trap of arguing from past inductive successes in order to show the viability of induction, which leads to circular reasoning. In fact, in epistemology, this problem has garnered an enormous amount of literature precisely because of its difficulties. Popper famously tried to get around the problem by shifting the focus to deductive falsification, where we discussed some problems with this in the video I made on the Duhem-Quine thesis. Others have argued from a point of view of Bayesianism, where we give credence to degrees of belief instead, using a process of updating beliefs, which gives rise to a probabilistic argument. In any case, this remains a very difficult problem, which has stumped a lot of philosophers over the years, both in epistemology and in the philosophy of science. Our very last entry, or major topic in philosophy of science, involves the reliability of scientific theories, that is, how much credence or faith should we give to well-tested scientific theories. This again is closely related to the realist-anti-realist debate, which we earlier examined. If one is a realist here, then one obviously thinks that well-supported and carefully scientific tested theories have not only passed important tests to corroborate their validity, but they will in addition make the stronger claim that these theories directly map or approximately map onto the real world, meaning the theories themselves says something about how our world functions at a very detailed approximate level. The anti-realists do not go that far, so they might think that the theories are useful, but that they do not give us an approximate true picture of an independent real world. Some have argued that it would be a miracle if successful theories gave such highly accurate predictions without themselves being true, as is argued in the no miracles argument, while others are more pessimistic and point out that the great majority of theories in the past have all been misproven, as argued in the pessimistic induction argument. While we have also seen radical changes occur, such as whole meal replacement of existing natural laws in terms of a scientific revolution. Lastly, a particular problem has been the problem of underdetermination, which I have discussed before, where no matter what body of scientific evidence we currently possess, it may still be insufficient in order to determine uniquely if the theory is indeed true. In this sense, we observe that all evidence necessarily underdetermines any scientific theory, as there are an infinite amount of competing theories we can conjure up, where in relation to testing we can always change auxiliary hypotheses or broader change definitions, existing backgrounds, etc., as shown in the Duhem-Quine thesis. Hence, this poses a real challenge for science, as many have observed, but there are also alternatives or counter-responses, such as performing new experiments which directly targets background assumptions or claim that there is no strict logical entailment of the existence of non-trivial alternative theories, which optimally should share the same scientific virtues as well as being well scientifically established candidates. Okay, so hopefully if you watch this video until its end, you will have observed that we have concerned ourselves much more with the ideas presented themselves rather than the figures, which was intentional, as the former is, in my opinion, much more important. There is in fact often a tendency to play favorites when it comes to constructing a philosophical approach by incorporating one or another philosopher, where of course it's much more important to discuss the philosophical ideas. This is also how we develop our philosophical toolkit, by paying attention to good critical thinking, value philosophical arguments in terms of merits and weaknesses, and progress through thinking about new ideas. In any case, I hope you got something out of this introduction. The goal here is, of course, as mentioned before, very much to encourage a takeaway of some core themes and vocabulary from this video, which should be of aid for other more specialized video that I cover in the future. Yeah, so please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers!